Well, hello, parents. Are you getting frustrated with those one-word answers from your teenager? Or maybe you're starting to feel a little disconnected from your son or daughter? Well, how would you like to have your son or daughter actively reach out and share their issues and concerns and even seek your advice? Or maybe to know that your teenager truly enjoys being around you and the rest of the family. I mean, that would be awesome, wouldn't it? Well, this is absolutely possible. And today I'm going to share 5 tips for how to get your teenager to talk. So let's get started. Well, hello again, everyone. My name is Jim White, and I'm an author, coach, and founder of the Family Enrichment Academy. And today we're going to answer the question of how to get your teenager to talk, or how to get them to open up and talk more to you. And before we jump into that, though, we're going to share 5 tips for that today. But before we do that, I want to let you know that I've got a free resource available that I'll share at the end of this video, and it just fits right into this conversation. So be sure to stick around to the very end. So let me ask you this question. When we ask teenagers, what do you wish your parents would do better? What do you think is the most common response that we get? When we ask this question, what they most typically say is they want their parents to listen better. So think of about that for a minute. If your goal is to get your teenager to talk more, to open up, could it be that the key to that is learning to listen better, or listen in a way that works for your teenager? So that's what we're going to be talking about. These 5 tips are 5 tips for better listening skills that you can use to help open up your teen. Now, those 5 skills we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to talk about asking clarifying questions. And then next, we're going to talk about acknowledging and what they're experiencing. And then validating is the third idea, is validating what they're experiencing. And then after that, we're going to talk about how do you be compassionate in the way that you listen. And then finally, we're going to talk about being present and just being aware and present to them as they're speaking to you. So anyway, those are the 5 areas we're going to talk through as we go through this video. So let's dive into that first one and talk about clarifying questions. What does that mean, and how can that work with your teenager? So the first listening tip that we're going to talk about today is asking clarifying questions. It's really pretty straightforward. It's a matter of just being a little bit more curious with your teen. And if you know, with teenagers, a lot of times they use words anyway that we may not understand or have some sense of what they mean by that. And so the clarifying question is intended to help draw out a little bit more information and help you to understand what they're really saying. Like, for example, one of the words that I know my daughter uses from time to time is the idea of being extra. She'll say, that Sarah was just extra today. And so the follow-up clarifying question would be, well, what do you mean when you say extra? I don't know if I quite get that. So can you tell me a little bit more about what that means? That's an example of asking a clarifying question. It helps the teenager know that you're listening to them, and it allows them to express a little bit more. Another example is sometimes they'll come home and they'll say something, like, well, my science class is just stupid. And again, you can follow up with, what do you mean by stupid? Again, that helps them to clarify what they mean by that. So the first tip is to engage with these clarifying questions as a way to get your teen to open up a little bit more and give you some more insight into what it is that they're talking about. So tip number 1, ask those clarifying questions. So listening tip number 2 is acknowledging what you heard from your teenager. All of us love to feel like we're being heard or listened to. And in this process of acknowledgement is really quite simple. You just repeat back or paraphrase back to your teen what it is that you heard them say. Here's a simple example. Let's say your teenager comes home and they said, I feel like I've been trying harder in math, but I'm not seeing better grades. And the acknowledgement back would be, so what I'm hearing you say is that you're making more effort, but you're not getting the results that you had hoped for. You see how, it's fairly simple, but at the same time, it communicates back that you heard what the teen said. And interestingly, if you don't paraphrase it right, back to them, and it doesn't make sense to them, they're going to say, no, that's not what I meant. And they're going to tell you more at that point, which leads back to that first tip that we talked about. You could ask a clarifying question as well. But the acknowledgement point is just repeating back and rephrasing or paraphrasing what you have heard from your teen. So that's tip number 2, is to acknowledge what you've heard. So listening tip number 3 is to validate what your teen is experiencing. Now, this is a little different than acknowledgement. Where acknowledgement, you're just repeating back what you heard. When you validate, what you're doing is you're letting them know that it makes sense what they're experiencing, what they're going through as part of this process. So let's say, again, your teen comes home and they're a little frustrated with their math, like we were talking about in that last example. The validation point is when you would, so again, they say, oh, I'm trying harder, but I'm just not getting the result I like. The validation would be, you say something like, well, I can see how with working harder and the more effort that you've been making, I can see how you'd be a little frustrated about the fact that you haven't had better grades. You see, we plug in the idea of being frustrated or what they're experiencing. And the point is, you're not trying to justify necessarily what they're going through, but you're just trying to validate and say, well, it kind of makes sense that you'd be experiencing that. So again, the validation just helps to tie in that experience as well as what they're actually saying. So again, tip number 3 is to look for some opportunities to validate what your teen is going through when they talk to you. So validation is key, tip number 3. So tip number 4 is to use compassion when you listen, or to be compassionate as you listen to your teen. So this is really more about your mindset and how you approach the conversation. And there's a couple things we have to really be careful for that would point to maybe you not being as compassionate or understanding. One of those things is to be very careful about passing judgment on what your teen is saying. And the second thing, and this is a big one as well, is that a lot of times we want to rush in and help to solve a problem when really the teen's not asking for that. They're just asking for you to listen to what they have to say. And those are forms of compassion, if you will, or coming with compassion. What you're doing is you're trying to see it from their perspective or be understanding of their perspective. Now, let me give you a quick example. Let's say your teenage daughter, for example, comes home. They're a little upset. You notice they're upset. You ask them, well, what happened today? And they break down, they start crying, they say, well, it was awful. I was in school and there was this other girl that had the same outfit on that I had. And now as a parent, you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's not that big of a deal. And maybe she needs to be more self-confident, or, it's easy for us to start to pass judgment and try to fix that problem or offer advice or suggestions to them. But that's not listening with compassion if we do that. Listening with compassion would be just letting her say what she needs to say and then responding with something like, well, I can see that was pretty upsetting for you. Again, you're not approving of the way they're responding. You're just listening, allowing them to have the feeling. And it goes back to that acknowledge and validate as part of it. But it's just being in that compassionate place. So if you can start to work some compassion into who you are as you're listening to your teen, that can go a long way, and it's a great listening skill to help them to open up and be comfortable in opening up to you and sharing more of their issues or struggles as well. If they know you're going to be compassionate, they're going to be much more likely to open up and share those things. So again, tip number 4 is to listen with compassion. So tip number 5 is to be present, or to stay present as you're listening to your team. And this really has a couple of different meanings. So first of all, being present is just about focusing and giving your attention to the teenager when they talk to you. I mean, we all struggle with this a little bit. It's easy if you got your phone, maybe a text comes in or an email, or you're working on the computer. It's easy to have a lot of other distractions going on. And so one of the things you can do from a listening skill standpoint is just really try to stay focused and present and with your teen when they're talking to you. So that's the first sort of angle of being present that I'm talking about. Now, the second piece of it is really about recognizing when your teenager is ready to talk. Now, unfortunately, they're not just going to walk up to you and say, hey, you got a few minutes, I have something I want to share with you. A lot of times it's a very subtle signal that they will give to you that says, hey, I'm ready, I would open up given the opportunity. Let me just give you a quick example. So my youngest daughter worked as a waitress in one of the local hamburger establishments here where we live. And one night she comes in, it's like 10 o'clock at night after her shift, and she had brought some food, and I just happened to be in the kitchen. And usually when we see each other, I'll say, how'd it go this evening? She says, fine, and then looks at her phone, and we're kind of, there's no conversation. But that on this particular night, she said, yeah, it was fine. And then she went on and she made this statement. She said, people can be so difficult sometimes. This is an example of where she was ready to talk if I gave her an opening to talk a little bit. And that's what I mean by being present. It was time. Even if I wasn't ready, and actually it was a little bit late in the evening, I was ready to go to bed, but this was an example of one of those situations where I needed to say, okay, this is an opportunity to talk and connect and build some of that relationship. And actually, the way I got the conversation to open up goes back to a little bit of curiosity and that clarifying that we talked about as tip number one. I said back to her, I said, what do you mean when you say people are so difficult? And just saying that gave her the opportunity to sort of open up. And she talked for 15 minutes or so, explaining all the different stuff that had happened that night. I used acknowledgement, validation, those other listening skills, and really just kind of sat there and listened. And eventually she was done, and we said our goodnights, and off to bed we went. But it was, that's an example of just being ready and open and sort of recognizing that signal that, oh, this is an opportunity. Be present enough that you recognize that signal, oh, this is an opportunity to talk, or maybe they have something to say, they want to get something off their chest. And again, a lot of times a great way to get them to open up is to ask a clarifying question or to be a little bit curious as well. So anyway, tip number 5 is to be present. Be present. Try to eliminate distractions, but also be aware of when they're ready to talk. And if they give you a little bit of a hint or a signal, you got to turn and focus your attention at that point and allow that conversation to happen. So again, tip number 5, be present. So let's take a few minutes to recap what we've talked about today. So we started off by the idea that if you ask a teenager what they really wish their parent would do better, one of the most common answers is they wish they would listen better. And actually this listening is the key to getting your teenager to open up and talk more. And so we've talked about 5 tips for better listening, and listening in a way that that will work for your teenager. So we talked about, first of all, asking clarifying questions. Then we talked about acknowledging what they said. Then we followed that with tip number 3 was to validate what they are experiencing or going through. And then tip number 4 was centered on listening with compassion, being compassionate as they listen. And then finally, we talked about just being present. And I think you will be amazed if you can start to work some of these skills into your conversations or as you're with your teenager. Literally within a day or two, you'll start to see them open up a little bit more, and you might be really surprised about how of an engaging conversation you can have with them. So work on those listening tips and become a better listener, the key to getting your teenager to open up and talk. So anyway, hope you found some value in this discussion. And actually, as I mentioned at the start of the video, I do have a bonus. This is something else I want to offer to you as a bonus. And what it is, if you think about listening to, the other piece is asking better questions. And actually part of this, like a clarifying question is a better question. And so the bonus resource I have for you is I have 10 questions that you should avoid or never ask your teen. Now think of these as like conversation killers. And then on top of that, I have an additional 10 questions that are great conversation starters. And so this resource, you can click the link below, share your email, and we'll send you a download. Again, 10 questions to never ask the conversation killers, and then 10 great questions that you can ask the conversation starters. So anyway, there's a free resource for you. Hopefully you can find some value in that as well and get that teen to open up a little bit. So again, it's truly an honor to be able to serve you as you move along your parenting journey. That's what we're here for with the Family Enrichment Academy, is just to provide as much value and help you move forward as much as we can. So again, it's an honor. I really appreciate you taking the time to stop and listen to this and watch this video. And remember, until next time, a change in perspective changes everything.